Pennsylvania's Republican Senator Pat Toomey. Senator, thanks for joining us. So here we are, more than 20 years after Columbine and other awful mass shootings, and we're sitting here again talking about 2 more mass shootings in the U.S. If we define the problem as we need to keep guns out of the wrong hands, what do we need to do? What will work?
Well, Jake, thanks for having me. Let's be honest. There's no simple, single measure that's going to permanently prevent criminals from finding a way to get guns and deranged people. My view is we can at least make it more difficult. And so I like to be very candid. The legislation that I've supported is not a panacea. But on the margins, if we do a background check on all commercial sales, we would make it more difficult for even criminals and deranged individuals, or make it more difficult for them to get a gun. You know, in Pennsylvania, we have universal background checks on all handgun sales. If I want to sell a handgun to my wife, we have to go and get a background check done. There are no exceptions. The legislation that Senator Manchin and I have been working on for years wouldn't be that broad, but it would say a commercial venue, whether it's online or whether it's at a gun show, would require a background check. An individual private transaction would not. I think that is a measure that's it's modest, it's sensible, and it has very broad support.
So let's talk about that compromise bill with Senator Manchin, the so-called closing the gun show loophole, which would not affect private sales, like you said, to your family or friends, but would if you go to a gun show. You first proposed it in 2013 after Sandy Hook. It requires background checks on sales at gun shows and online. I remember you being on the show talking about this. The bill failed because of a filibuster led by your own party, and I remember you being very frustrated because the NRA was misrepresenting the legislation. Have you spoken to your Republican colleagues about whether they might support equivalent legislation today?
I've been speaking with a number of colleagues about this idea of whether or not we should apply background checks to all commercial sales. There are a lot of different ways you could go about it, mechanically, for instance, but the answer is yes. I've had a number of conversations, and there is some level of interest.
Do you think there would be 60 votes? Because last time, enough Republicans basically filibustered the bill, so that because you didn't have 60 votes, you had like 55, 56.
Yeah, so it would depend on what's in the bill, right? I mean, so we know the House bill doesn't even have unanimous Democratic support. So filibuster is not even relevant. It doesn't have majority support. The question is, could we make some changes, some modifications, so that we could get to 60? And ultimately, I'll tell you, a big part of this is going to be to get started is up to Senator Schumer. Does he want to have a chance at getting an outcome, getting the 60 votes, or does he just want to see something fail so that he can use it for political purposes? If he decides the former, then we really need to take a very hard run at this. I do think there is some support that wasn't there in the past. If he decides that he just wants to have a failed vote, why then there's no prospect.
Now, as you noted, even this wouldn't necessarily be a panacea.
Right.
It's unclear that expanding background checks would have stopped either of these shooters in Boulder or Atlanta. Neither had felony criminal records. But let me ask you this. Both, according to friends and family, were behaving in unstable, irrational ways. Now, Colorado has a so-called red flag law, which, quote, creates the ability for a family or household member or a law enforcement officer to petition the court for a temporary extreme risk protection order to keep a firearm out of that person's hands. Is this the kind of thing more Americans need to be talking about? If people in their family are behaving in ways that they think, boy, I'm worried about my brother Sam, and I'm so worried about him, I want to make sure that he's not able to get a gun. Should this be more part of the conversation?
Yes, and I can tell you in conversations with my colleagues it comes up because we do see repeatedly that there's usually some kind of evidence that something's not right before a person goes off and commits these atrocities. And so having some way to intervene before it's too late, I think that does resonate with a lot of folks. The details are important. You have to have due process. Obviously, if you didn't do it right, it would become an easy thing for someone to just retaliate against an enemy or or after a breakup, somebody who they wanted to sort of get back at. And you'd have to make sure you had a process that prevented that kind of abuse. But to your point, yes, we do see this repeatedly in these kinds of cases.
Republican Senator Lindsey Graham said yesterday he does not support your plan. Alabama Republican Senator Tommy Tuberville said, quote, "I think we've got enough background checks." What do you say to them?
Look, we just disagree. That's not uncommon, as you know, in this business to disagree with colleagues. I've never represented this as a panacea, but I do think it's okay and reasonable for us to make it more difficult for the people that we all agree shouldn't have firearms, right? Violent criminals and dangerously mentally ill people. Since we agree they shouldn't have them, why not make it a little more difficult for them to get them? So I have multiple firearms. The background check is not a cumbersome or onerous thing. I don't consider it at all an infringement on my Second Amendment rights, which I think are very important to me and all of the people I represent. But a quick background check to make it more difficult for a dangerous person to get a firearm, to me, that's just common sense.
Republican Senator Pat Toomey from the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, thank you so much. Good to see you again.
Thanks for having me, Jake.